Hi everyone. I had a chance to finally watch Alien Covenant. I saw Alien Covenant as well as have my birthday party afterwards, and I will say first and foremost that I had an equally good time with both. So, before I say anything, of course, this is a new place that I'm staying at, so the room looks different, so I just wanted to address that quickly in regards to the different background that you're seeing in this video. Moving on, I wanted to, with this video, address the first impressions that I had with Covenant. So you're all probably wondering, did I like the film or not? Especially those of you who told me that I should withhold any sort of judgment in regards to the critics that I've been attacking in regards to Covenant, what they've had to say about it, without having seen the film. A lot of people have been concerned, oh, well, you need to watch the movie first. And I have seen the film now. And I can safely say that my feelings in regards to these critics have not changed. If anything, watching the film has only confirmed how I felt in regards to what I thought and why these critics were attacking the film. And I thought to myself, you know, unless this movie is stupendously bad, like The Room bad or Troll 2 bad, I really don't think that I'm going to take back anything that I've said in regards to these critics, like Angry Joe or Red Letter Media. No, rather, having seen the film, I found myself sort of confirming a lot of the things that I was wondering would be true or not be true. Because a lot of people said, well, wait until you see the film. You may just find yourself eating crow. And I have to say to you all that no. But in fact, a lot of the things that I said in regards to the bad criticism and essentially applying double standards in regards to Covenant versus Aliens or whatever favorite they have in the franchise, they essentially compare to Covenant and they say that Covenant isn't good, even though the flaws that it has are also present in Aliens or Alien in regards to, say, stupid behavior, for instance. So none of those things really went away. Now, the movie itself, when I sat down, I remember people saying to me, okay, you're going to watch the movie with friends and family, and it's going to change the way that you think in regards to, okay, am I going to be an effective critic if I'm with people who think exactly like me in this situation? And I dare say it would be very difficult for me to find people who thought more alike me than my twin or my mother or my younger brother. We all have a similar sort of taste in things. So yes, I will say that it made the experience rather enjoyable. But it was the type of experience where generally there wasn't much being said between us as we watched the film, apart from maybe a giggle here or there or a comment of appreciation towards some of the classical allusions that Scott made. We mostly just sat and watched the film. After the film was over, we talked about it briefly, and I asked them some questions in regards to what they liked or didn't like about the film. Generally speaking, they all enjoyed it rather much. So, when I sat down to watch this movie, I kept that in mind, and I thought, okay, I'm going to watch this, and I'm going to enjoy myself, but I'm also going to try and be a critic. I'm going to multitask here. I'm going to watch the movie and enjoy myself and have fun because it's my birthday, and I should be doing that, especially since I'm with such like-minded individuals. But I also thought to myself, okay, I'm going to try and be a critic here. I'm going to try and analyze this film as I would Alien, or I would Aliens, or any movie that is either good or bad. I have a tendency when I sit down to watch films to just view them on their own strengths and merits. And at the same time, I did find myself comparing this film to other films in the franchise. It's inevitable to a certain degree, but I did it for reasons of criticism, not for generalized statements like, okay, Alien is the best and I have confirmation bias, so I'm going to make a comparison to Alien to prove that Alien is a film that I like because Covenant is bad. I had no such intention. If I made a comparison to Alien, it's only to point out that the structure of the films is slightly different in spots. And the point of this video, of course, is to sort of touch on my first impressions. I won't go too deep into specifics. There will probably be some spoilers in this video. The video is meant to be short, and I will have a longer, in-depth review in regards to the film later, of course. But for right now, I just wanted to sort of say that my general sort of first impressions with the film. And again, they're mostly positive. I didn't find myself really feeling disappointed. I went into the experience kind of knowing what to expect. for several reasons. One, I talked to a lot of people beforehand, and I spoiled myself to a certain extent, except in this case, I lowered my expectations and I told myself, go into the film measuring it on its own strengths and weaknesses and enjoy it for what it is. And you know what? Being spoiled didn't really affect my enjoyment of the film. There was much to appreciate in regards to the classical allusions, the musical classical allusions, the visual strength of Scott that's typical of all of his films. My impressions of the film were uniformly positive. I found myself smiling and laughing and just enjoying myself, but not laughing in the sense that, okay, I'm mocking this film, but laughing to myself because I was enjoying what I was watching. As to why that is, again, I was determined to go into this film to have a good time. So you might say that I was determined to go into the film and not look at it objectively. Quite the contrary. I was determined to enjoy what would be there to enjoy if it were there. So, in other words, if I found something that I liked, I was going to appreciate it. That's what I mean by that. And if there were things that I didn't like, I would make note of those and talk about them in my review. Again, this is a shorter video, so I won't have time to go into great length about what I disliked, but there were a couple of things that I will say I noticed, but it didn't affect my overall enjoyment of the film. But these were very small things, mostly cosmetic or aesthetic choices in regards to people lamenting the fact that this film having a larger budget, they opted for something more earthly and familiar in the sense that you had the Greco-Roman sort of design for the alien city, and a lot of people said, well, why didn't they use H.R. Geiger's sort of biomechanical landscape instead, like something truly alien? And it's all good and fine to make that argument and say, why didn't they try and create something truly alien? That's not really possible, though. It's like the Journal of the Mad Arab and the Lovecraftian mythos, or maybe it's the Necronomicon. The idea of a book that you write and someone reads it and they go insane because the book is designed to drive you insane. Is it really possible to create something like that as a human? No, because anything that you write is going to be coming from a sample of one. Essentially, it's coming from human authors. It's not truly alien. And certain writers, I think, are fairly good at evoking that alien feeling, but ultimately, I wasn't completely dismayed by the approach that they took in regards to the alien aesthetic in the Engineer City. I didn't stop and say, you know, I really wanted that alien cityscape. Yes, I would have enjoyed it quite a bit, but it's quite common in plenty of films where you have demons and Lovecraftian sort of nods, like Hellboy, for instance, where there are sort of nods to that Lovecraftian codified mythos, and yet you still have plenty of things that are fairly human by design. Hellboy, for instance, is very anthropomorphic and is constantly cracking one-liners and making jokes and smoking cigars. So you're going to have alien elements, but you're also going to have human elements. And yes, in Alien, they will make the argument that that alien ship felt very alien and Lovecraftian in the sense that it's a very isolated sort of incident in the alien universe where you have something that feels truly alien. But this would be difficult, I think, to replicate in a larger sort of scale to where you have the entire film feel alien. It's easier to do that in isolated incidents, whereas if you try and do it for the entire film, you're going to have something that feels surreal, like Pink Floyd's The Wall, or you have Pink Floyd's music set to the really wacky sort of animation that they had for that film. But it won't necessarily feel alien, because again, you're going to be looking at this for a long period of time and reflecting on it, which is very different than having one or two quick scenes. If you have one or two quick scenes, again, the scenes are paced quite well, but they only give you enough time to have essentially a first reaction to something, as opposed to if the entire film were set in this alien setting, you would eventually grow accustomed to what you were seeing. I don't care how alien it is. Ultimately, these things are designed by artists. So with Geiger and his biomechanical landscapes, you have to keep in mind that he was one artist of many. And there were other artists in the film. Ron Cobb, for instance, designed the human spaceship, and then you had Mobius design the space suits, and you had the semiotic standard, and you had all of those things being designed. And there was, I believe, one or two other artists. Dan O'Bannon had a hand in it. Ridley Scott, of course, with his storyboards. Then you had Geiger. Geiger was just one element, okay? And yet you have this favoritism of sorts with Geiger. Well, unfortunately, Geiger is dead at this point. You know, he's not an active part of the project. And you could have people replicate it, of course, but at the same time, you just have to keep in mind that with Covenant, you have nods to plenty of other artists. Not only do you have artists that are working on the films themselves, but you have allusions to classical works of art. Michelangelo's David, there was a Renaissance painting, I believe, in there at one point. And The Isle of the Dead, another painting whose artist, I can't remember off the top of my head, the person who created that, but that was like directly in the film. To say that this film isn't appreciative of art is ludicrous, because it's all over the place in regards to its homages. It's a very art-conscious film. It's not pretentious in that way. People are disappointed because they didn't get what they wanted, but there's much to appreciate. And if you go into a film appreciating for what it provides rather than what you wanted it to have but it doesn't provide, I think you'll enjoy the film a lot more. In regards to, say, some of the nods to Romantic era poetry. My mother, her lullaby to us was Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Xanadu and Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Those were our lullabies as children. And when we went into this film, I dare say it would be difficult for you to find an intended reader more qualified than my mother, my brothers, and I. All of us recognized Shelley and Byron, and for instance, when David says that Ozymandias was written by Byron, my mother automatically leaned over to me and said, "No, that's not true. Shelley wrote that. Percy Bysshe Shelley wrote that." And so she knew automatically. So you would say that we are the ideal readers. Perhaps the ones, it's difficult to say whether or not Scott intended that for us, because again, this film was given a wide release to many individuals that I dare say would not have known that when David made his mistake and he said that Byron wrote Ozymandias. There were probably plenty of people at the theater who didn't realize that that was a mistake, and only when Walter pointed it out and said Shelley wrote Ozymandias, not Byron, it would have come as a surprise to them. Whereas my mother and my twin and I all looked at each other and we knew exactly what was going on. So it's like the cave in The Empire Strikes Back. What's in the cave? Only what you take with you. And it's impossible for me to shed my love for romantic poetry, for instance. There's no way to really sort of separate myself from that, or my childhood, because it was a part of my upbringing. In Brandon Lee's final interview, he said, "Can you imagine something so intrinsic or integral to your life, say a book or a movie, that you could not picture your life without it? It forms a part of you when you read it or you watch it. It becomes a part of you to the degree that you could not remove yourself from it or imagine yourself without it if you tried." And like Luke going into the cave in Empire Strikes Back, I went into this movie as though I were Luke going into the cave, except I was aware of what I was taking in with me. I knew that I would go into this film with an appreciation for a lot of the classical allusions that may go over the casual audience members' heads. So I was fully prepared to enjoy those for what they were. Does it make me, say, a member of a minority? Perhaps, but I also believe that it makes me the ideal viewer for this film. Someone who is able to appreciate it for what it's trying to get people to appreciate, which are classical allusions to poetry and art and music, which are important to Scott as an artist and as a filmmaker. Otherwise, why make a film about them? In regards to that, I think he did a fine job. And some people say that it's pretentious, his inclusion or insertion of these shoehorned elements into what people would say is their beloved franchise. Well, I beg to differ. It is, in fact, Ridley's franchise. We are individuals who can appreciate things in the sense that, like Walter, we may be able to say played the flute, or we may be able to sit down and watch Alien, but we are not David, like Ridley is. David can create things. He is a god of sorts. And Ridley, I don't mean to be extreme here when I say this, but in the sense of him being a creator, he is very much like David. He is the god of this particular franchise in the sense that he created it and he can do as he wishes. And whether or not this sort of fits in with what people want in regards to whether or not they find something pretentious in regards to, say, classical illusions, is not something that probably concerns Ridley. He's cynical of us as an audience, and he decides to do things because he chooses to, because he can. Is he going to ruffle some feathers? Of course. But the gods are known for being mercurial, capricious, doing as they wish, and Ridley is very much that type of god. He doesn't necessarily aim to please everyone, which in and of itself would be a foolhardy endeavor. So, when I hear people complain about certain elements in Prometheus or Alien Covenant, now that I've seen the film, and I hear them say it's pretentious, I remind myself that they are not me. I am what you would call an ideal audience member for this particular film, whereas most people who say, this is pretentious, it is coming from a place of ignorance, or it is coming from the place of someone who does not have an appreciation for these things. If they did, are you honestly telling me if you appreciated the poetry of Byron, the poetry of Shelley, or the artwork that is alluded to in this film, are you honestly telling me that if you had an appreciation for that, you would still call it pretentious as it's used in the film? You're free to make that argument, and doubtless there are certain individuals out there who would suggest the hypothetical circumstance that this is in fact reality, but there are individuals out there who prefer it not in a cinematic format. Leave Byron out of the movies, essentially, or don't do it the way that Scott did. And yet I don't feel that Scott was pretentious. I felt as though his discussion of these various classical themes in his film was very much made by the decision of someone who has the ability to create and who understands and appreciates these things as an artist does. And how do artists appreciate things? They create things themselves in imitation or paying homage to something that they appreciate. For instance, when Wordsworth wrote Resolution and Independence, you had other authors like Lewis Carroll who wrote poems in response to that poem, directly in response to it. As poets, they would create. Poesis, the ability that I believe in that word in Greek means to create, essentially, and the idea that poets create poetry. It represents a creative artistic force. And that Ridley, through the inclusion of these various elements in his film, is essentially paying homage to them through the art of creation, in the same sense that David is essentially paying homage to the same things, even though he may not entirely realize it, and he may not fully understand everything that he's paying homage to. He's a little bit glitchy in the film, of course, and he confuses Shelley's poetry with Byron's, and according to Walter, if one note wrong can bring down an entire symphony, eventually. Which, of course, I don't know if that's entirely true or not. I understood the argument when he was making it, of course. And I found myself thinking, again, back to some of the arguments I made in regards to the bad criticism of people who were essentially trashing Covenant and saying that it was a bad film. And I immediately thought, yes, these individuals will look at these classical illusions and say to themselves, this is pretentious. Scott inserting Byron and Shelley and Michelangelo into his film, or Wagner. What a pretentious old man. Who does he think he is, trying to foist these things onto a modern audience who couldn't possibly appreciate them for how they were appreciated or valorized back when they were new, when poets were worshipped as poets with a capital P, proper noun, as gods among men, creators, in a class of their own. In the days of Shelley and Byron, poets would have been elevated in regards to their role in society. It was something different than it is now. Nowadays, of course, poets are sort of ridiculed, and their place in society is much more uncertain. But in the days of Shelley and Byron and Blake and Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Keats and so on and so forth, to be a poet was to be something desired. And Scott is again trying to resurrect these feelings of godhood amongst creators, and yet, of course, there is a dark sort of twist in that the creator in the film, David, is someone who creates monsters. So, when I hear people say that this is pretentious, I again remind myself that these individuals are perhaps not the intended or ideal audience for the film. It may not be for them, and despite the fact that this film got a wide release, it speaks in volumes that it's not doing well at the box office because it doesn't register with as many people. Poets, even in Wordsworth's day, were not common. In the prelude to lyrical ballads, he wrote a defense of poetry, where he said the poet must write to men in the common man and the common tongue, and yet he must also be a poet and speak in the language of a poet. Sort of a paradox, don't you think? And in regards to Scott, you have someone who is addressing the common man through the wide release of an established franchise, and yet he is speaking in the language of a poet or a creator, which is alienating his audience. Is this a mistake, however? No, it's an artistic statement, and any artistic statement made by someone who is qualified to make it, in other words, made by someone who is, say, a god or a poet, is perfectly acceptable. The goal of a poet is to create, to make artistic statements, and in regards to this, I find no fault in Scott. Certain people, of course, are attacking him and saying that, Scott, what are you doing? You need to pander. And there is a certain amount of fan service, if you want to call it that, certain alien elements. And in regards to all of that, aside from all of the classical allusions to the romantic poets of yore, and the classical composers, Wagner, and even in Alien you had Mozart, how did I feel about some of the nods to the original film, the original creature, the monsters of the movie? That is, apart from David, who may be the most monstrous of all. I enjoyed it quite a bit. In regards to the special effects, I found much to appreciate. And again, I don't really want to go in specifics. I feel as though this video is already rather long, and I've barely begun to scratch the surface as to why I appreciated it. But as far as the special effects go, for instance, I enjoyed them quite a bit. I thought the effects for the neomorph worked rather well. I knew that you had essentially what were practical effects that had been touched up digitally, as far as I understand the special effects process for the film. Perhaps someone could correct me on that or sort of clarify things, but they took a practical suit and they polished it, or they touched it up with digital effects. And this gave it somewhat of a glow. Imagine a fairy, if you will, the fae and their glamour. And there was something otherworldly about it, or something out of place or uncanny even. And there was a certain kind of effect to that in regards to the special effects and the way they were approached in this film. However, were they as bad as, say, ADI's debacle with The Thing prequel in 2011, where their practical effects were entirely replaced by digital effects? No. And in regards to the xenomorph, there was maybe one shot in the film that I could think of where it really didn't look good. But apart from that one shot, yes, most of the scenes that it was in, it looked slightly digital, but it looked good as far as I'm concerned. It was well portrayed, I think, and I can't really talk about it more than that without going into detail, but I will say that I was quite satisfied with the monster effects in the film. I was quite satisfied with the gore and the violence, and it was an excellent combination of practical effects and digital effects. And there were certain scenes that I was curious about in the film. I was wondering about what would happen and how things would go down. And ultimately, I didn't find myself feeling disappointed with what happened. I'm not saying that there weren't a couple of things that I noticed that felt a little off to me, of course. No film is perfect by any stretch of the imagination. In regards to the pacing of Alien Covenant, I thought, well, what makes or breaks a film ultimately is editing, and one complaint that I can partially understand, of course, is the pacing of the film in the second half feels quick. And as far as that goes, It felt as though there was a lot of footage towards the final act of the film. Once they're on board, the Covenant and Walter and Tennessee and Daniels and the other three remaining crew members, are safely on board the ship, and all seems to be well at this point. I felt as though that was a little too quick, and they had certain things occur off screen that I felt as though, okay, well, maybe this feels accelerated, but it doesn't feel nearly as rushed as, say, the ending to Prometheus, with the confrontation between Shaw and the last engineer and the trilobite. That is about as rushed as you can get. That scene lasted about maybe a minute. I don't really want to go into specifics as far as that goes. I want to save that for a longer review. And I know this video is already about 28 minutes long, but with my review, I really want to go into detail about the film. I want to talk about individual scenes. There's so much I want to talk about, and again, I feel as though there's a lot that I want to say about the film and how people are responding to it, and I kind of want to leave it at that. I mean, what else can I address in the closing moments of this video in regards to, is the film a mess? I didn't think the film was a mess, and I want to address certain scenes that I recall people attacking, stupid moments that I remember reading about, and I feel as though I could devote an entire series of videos to Alien Covenant in regards to stupid scenes. Well, which ones? And for this video, I think I'll just pick one of them, and I'll talk about it as briefly as I can, because again, I want to keep this video under, say, 45 minutes, but I have a tendency, of course, to sort of extrapolate and talk at length about things. It's my style, and if you're new to my videos, well, that's how I operate, and it's not really changing anytime soon. However, one scene that I did want to talk about was the flute scene. And I remember hearing about people laughing uncontrollably at this and making Family Guy references and so on and so forth, giggity giggity, and I don't recall feeling that when watching this. And I am a very sexually preoccupied individual. I'm a hentai artist, okay? I draw erotic art. I think about sex all the time, though I think that most guys who are of a particular orientation have a tendency to think about sex all the time. I mean, what guy doesn't think about breasts or fucking or whatever floats his boat? Of course he's going to think about that from nanosecond to nanosecond. I think most guys are engaged at some level thinking about sex. So I'm not saying that I'm like some sort of asexual being, and when I went into this scene I felt nothing because I don't experience sexual thoughts. Newsflash, I do. It's a part of my profession, and I think it's a part of my sex. As a male of the species, I believe that it's a part of my nature, my physiology even, to think about sex. So when I went into this, I don't think it's my fault necessarily. And it depends though, because how do you explain why certain people are sort of flying off the handle and saying, oh well, this is unnecessarily funny? Again, the idea of the cave. What's in the cave? Only what you bring with you. And I think certain people went into this film with a certain outlook. Call it a maturity level, if you will. And I'm not saying that making fun of sex is immature by any means, but I do think that, again, it could have been confirmation bias. They could have been looking for an excuse to make fun of the film. And you could say, here's a potential for innuendo and seduction. And I'm not saying that it's not there, but it wasn't at the forefront of my mind. And I wasn't dead set on skewering this film, no pun intended. I felt as though, yes, I could see how someone could make that argument. You do the blowing, I'll do the fingering. But I was focused on the music. I was focused on the philosophical arguments that they were making. My mind was elsewhere. As someone who, yes, I can understand sex in a movie, and you have the shower scene, for instance, later in the film. It's kind of a sexy scene, and guess what I was thinking about when I was watching that? Sex. Go figure. And I could certainly understand why certain individuals would say, okay, with the flute scene in Covenant, yeah, there's the potential for innuendo. There's no way to really excise that. But I think that has as much to do with the individual watching the scene as it does the scene itself. And when I went in to watch the scene, again, I wasn't seeking to torpedo this film. I wasn't looking to tear it apart. And when I watched the scene, I thought to myself, I remembered hearing people talk about, oh yeah, there's this scene, and I hated that scene because, again, the sexual innuendos were unintentionally funny, and people saw this and they dismissed it outright. So you could argue that, oh, I wasn't a virgin, right? And I went into that scene spoiled because I knew what was coming, and ergo I could sort of mentally shield myself from the stupidity of the scene. Ludicrous. I was fully aware of the innuendos at play, but they were not something that I gravitated towards. You could argue that the scene was the same for me and the other individual watching it, and yet the individuals who responded negatively to the scene did so because of their own composition, because of their own agenda, because they had certain reasons for watching the film, expectations, if you will. Perhaps there was just a little bit of confirmation bias there when they sat down to watch that scene. And again, I'm not saying that it doesn't exist in some shape or form, the innuendos and the seduction, but it just didn't feel quite as front and center to me, purely because, again, I was fixated on other things, and I didn't find myself chanting, okay, I need to ignore the innuendos, and I need to think about something else because I'm just determined to defend this scene. It didn't feel like that at all. I just found myself fascinated by what the two androids were talking about in regards to playing the music and watching him slowly play the music, and then David controlling his fingers, and then suddenly Walter playing the music rather quickly on his own, and then of course he and David continuing to have their discussion about creating and the quoting of Shelley's poetry and the differences between their designs and how Walter said that people were unnerved by David. I liked that. And the fundamental differences between the characters in regards to Walter being someone who was different at a basic level in regards to belief, or I'm sorry, not belief, but duty, as opposed to what David would call love. And yet the irony of all of this is that Walter's duty is closer to what many of us would prefer love to be, rather than what David calls love. David's love is very destructive, whereas Walter's duty is to protect. And I found myself really caring for Walter. And I'm not saying I didn't enjoy David. I loved David. Speaking of videos, I could take a whole video and talk about just how awesome David is. So that's one scene that I wanted to talk about in regards to a scene that I felt like was getting a lot of unnecessary hate. Because I've seen plenty of films that have what you would call ostensibly pointless scenes, and yet you have to remind yourself, tell yourself this: why does the scene feel pointless? It's because it deviates away from the format that Aliens had. You have to keep in mind, Alien was Gothic horror, and Alien was something closer to Zulu Dawn, or an action film, with numbers being the emphasis. And the structure of the films is virtually identical. And with a scene like the flute scene in Alien Covenant, suddenly it feels pointless because it deviates from that structure. And the interesting paradox, of course, is that you expect the structure present in the first two films. It's part of what made them great. And yet you have an artist like Scott who said, you know what, I'm going to deviate away from that, and I'm going to talk about philosophical things, I'm going to talk about art and creation. And it feels pointless because it deviates away from that structure. And yet if you have scenes that are a little bit too close to the mark of the structure of Alien or Aliens, then you say it's derivative. A little hypocritical, don't you think? Given that the ending in Aliens is virtually identical to the ending in Alien. And it's sort of a fine line between using the same formula in a way that is successful and then being derivative. And when people say that the flute scene feels pointless in Covenant, I find that, well, it's not pointless. It deviates away from the expected format. And again, you can make arguments all day about, yes, again, I went into the film sort of intent on defending it. So I'm making certain arguments, but I could also equally, in response, make the opposite argument for you, saying that you went into the film to attack it. Ergo, this is how you are responding. But ultimately, in my case, what is true is that I went into the film determined to simply watch and observe and say, lo and behold, we have the structure in Alien and Alien present in spots, you have deviations, and you have Scott taking the film in different directions. So as far as I'm concerned, yes, I could understand why certain people might say it feels messy, because it does switch gears, and it takes the film in new directions, and the pacing is different, but overall I felt the tone of the film was quite consistent. It felt as consistent to me as Aliens did. And I don't really want to say much more about the film at this point, other than, again, I liked it, and I went into the film intent on enjoying what there was to be enjoyed, which varies from individual to individual, mind you. And again, the people who say that the allusions to Byron and Shelley are pretentious need to keep in mind that it's probably pretentious in regards to them, given their capacity or lack thereof to actually appreciate these things in and of themselves, let alone if they are coupled with a cinematic approach. If someone says, I don't like Wagner, would you expect me to believe that they enjoy listening to Wagner in their free time? No. And my brother, for instance, is a classical music aficionado, and he really enjoys the application of classical music in cinema. Anytime you have classical music in film, he smiles to himself and he says, ah yes, Chopin's Raindrop Prelude at the end of Prometheus, or the Goldberg variations in Silence of the Lambs, or Ein Klein Nachtmusik in Alien, or any other film that you could possibly think of where they had music that was directly performed by a real-world composer as opposed to written by a composer for the film specifically. And my brother appreciates the music for what it is, and when he sees something like that used in the film, he's not going to say that it's pretentious because he can appreciate it just for what it is. He appreciates Wagner for Wagner, and when it's used in the film, he delights in this fact, and he wouldn't say that it's pretentious. And if someone said, oh, Scott using Wagner is pretentious, I would question that person's ability to appreciate Wagner, to be excited, to simply see it in the film. I mean, I love that kind of inclusion. For instance, take something obscure. If Scott did a film, an Alien film, and he took the level 1 theme from Mega Man X, the Prelude theme, for instance, or Chill Penguin's stage, and he incorporated those into the film, I would probably enjoy it. Now, of course, that's a rather hyperbolic example, and it would depend entirely on the context. But the way that Scott did it in the film, I thought made sense. He didn't just randomly insert the themes into the film, say Django Unchained, with the various musical themes that the songs from the soundtrack that Tarantino has a tendency to just shoehorn into his movies. I appreciate that, but at times it feels shoehorned, pigeonholed. It's very jarring, but I can appreciate it. And with Scott, the inclusion of Wagner, for instance, worked on several levels. You had the piano scene at the start, for instance, where David is talking to Wayland, and Wayland asks him to play something on the piano, to which David responds, what would you like me to play? Dealer's choice. So David plays Wagner's Introduction of the Gods into Valhalla by Richard Wagner, to which Wayland says a tad anemic without the orchestra, and yet it made sense to me. It didn't feel pretentious. It's a man watching his creation playing the piano. At first he tells him to rise from his chair, to ambulate, to walk. And he's telling him to do things, and he's merely observing him, and he wants him to choose something. Is that pretentious? No, it fits within the context of the scene. He's literally just created something. He's made life. It's alive. And he suddenly wants to see what it can do. Well, what happens if I ask it to play something at the piano, and then it picks Wagner? Is that pretentious? No, it's a curious choice. I mean, why Wagner? Why not anything else? Would it be any more or less pretentious if he picked Love Me Tender or Chopsticks? I don't think so. It doesn't matter. The musical choice is, again, completely arbitrary. It's the first musical selection made by David, his first day in life, awake, aware. It's his first choice. It could have been anything. The message would be the same. The fact that it's Wagner, to me, doesn't feel pretentious. Not in the slightest. And you hear the theme again, where David evidently has a hankering for old Wagner, and at the end of the film requests that Mother play it for him while he conducts his rounds. Did it feel pretentious for me in this circumstance? No, it's merely a coda, if you will. You know, a return to that theme established earlier on in the film, giving the movie a music-like feel. Is that pretentious? No. But again, I walk into these things determined to appreciate things that I generally do enjoy, like music or art, philosophy, or romantic poetry. What I take into the cave is what I face in the cave, just like Luke in Empire Strikes Back. So, the people who say that something is pretentious really need to take a look at themselves and realize that perhaps what is pretentious, ostensibly about these things, is actually their own ignorance, or what they take into the cave, be it an agenda or a chip on their shoulder in regards to them being fans of a particular franchise that they feel doesn't see eye to eye with Scott's vision. And that's their problem, not mine. When I sat down and watched this film, I found plenty of things to enjoy, and very little to actually complain about in regards to my family and what they thought. They liked it. I even asked my brother, did you find anything about this film to dislike? And he said no. This is my little brother, not my twin brother. And he said, I actually liked it quite a bit. I thought it was cool. And I asked my twin, what did you think of this? And he's like, oh, I thought it was cool. You know, again, he looked at the film merely to appreciate it for what it was, rather than attack it for what it wasn't. And I feel as though with criticism, we should focus on what something is if we're going to sort of get anything germane or salient out of the arguments that we're trying to make. Yes, the film wasn't what some people wanted. I understand that. But ultimately, what you're talking about isn't the film, but the film that you wanted it to be, which are two different things. As far as film criticism goes, I believe that a critic should look at a film and study it for what it is, not what it isn't. So if you have, you know, an opinion about something, like the pacing, for instance, you can, you know, mention it to me and maybe I'll talk about it. So it's up to you guys. But I'll also think of things myself to talk about in regards to, say, the gore. I want to do a video about stupid decisions. Okay, I really want to do that one. That's probably the one I'm going to do next. And if you guys, as my audience, have other things besides, please, again, let me know, and I'll consider making videos about that as well. So I'll do my own, but feel free to make suggestions, and I'll keep my ears and eyes open. And if you like my video, feel free to like it, subscribe if you haven't already. It means a lot to me, as well as share my content. You know, there's only so much of that I can do myself, so any bit of sharing that you can do on your own channels and your own networks, I appreciate that a great deal because it helps a lot. And until next time, guys, stay tuned because I will be doing a longer review of the film, which again I'll probably be, it will be simplest at this point just to divide it up into videos, but they'll probably be just as long as this one. Again, I wanted to keep this video short, but I couldn't. I tried and I couldn't, and it's just not my style, you know. So if you came expecting sort of a quick simple video about Covenant, and you actually sat through all this. Well, I'm sorry to have wasted your time, but again, I like the film a great deal, but stay tuned as I continue to release more videos about it, because I plan on talking about this film for quite a while. I think, just there's much to discuss. But until then, take care, guys, and thanks for watching.